Down, down, forward, forward, punch. The fireball is possibly the most recognizable attack in all of video games, though some people do still somehow manage to get it wrong. Anyway, the fireball input has a remarkably long history actually, spanning across like 36 or so years, starting in 1987 with Capcom's Street Fighter, where director Takashi Nishiyama and planner Hiroshi Matsumoto saw to its inclusion. Long as its history may be, does it have a rich history though? I don't know. Let's find out. Now, firstly, let's just get this out of the way. Some of you might already be questioning the point of doing an analysis of only the fireball input and not a cooler input, like, maybe the Dragon Punch input. When we look at it, it's like a cool Z motion. Or why not do like every other creator on the entire planet and do some sort of breakdown of motion inputs in general? Why not do that? Well, you see, a short time ago I did a video about alternative controllers or alternative input peripherals, yada yada yada, where I said the following. A quarter circle forward is a quarter circle forward, regardless of if you're playing 1999 Street Fighter 3 Third Strike or 2022's DNF Duel. After which, some very nice people pointed out in the comments that they believe this sort of fact I presented to, in fact, be erroneous. I'm sort of lying here because it wasn't some people as much as it was one person, and they weren't nice about it as much as they were saying that I was just making shit up. Now, I'm probably not as much of a certified gamer as Young Doffy here, which means I don't actually have the confidence to just flatly reject this objection of theirs. I am, however, nothing if not a vindictive piece of shit, so in the interest of finding out if this objection is reasonable or not, let's try to answer the following two questions. 1. Does the fireball input, down, forward, forward, or quarter circle forward, or whatever you want to call it, meaningfully differ between titles? More specifically, does it allow for shortcuts in the inputs, like skipping an input or, I don't know, doing it in reverse or some shit like that? And secondly, does the fireball input timing meaningfully differ between titles? Does the requirement on the user make significant jumps between game to game? Now, I don't have the time to test every fighting game ever made. I mean, who has the time for that? But I do still hold a sort of innate, bubbling hatred of any person that questions me at all, which means that the list of titles that I have checked is still somewhat lengthy. It consisting of the following titles. Now, before we get into any of the actual results, I'm going to clarify here that games like Mortal Kombat or NRS that allow you to technically skip, I suppose, a down-forward input to execute a fireball don't actually count, since they are sort of definitionally still a down-forward input and not a quarter circle forward. They're not the same thing. They don't count. Additionally, some of their titles do actually allow you to switch from, I don't know, like Mortal Kombat inputs into traditional inputs. And in those cases, you actually can't execute a fireball by doing down forward and skipping the down forward. This is a bit hard to talk about. Anyway, fuck those games, they don't matter. Input shortcuts of different kinds actually start cropping up in fighting games pretty damn early. Capcom in Street Fighter 3, for example, allowing you to skip one input of the double quarter circle forward, or allowing you to execute a Dragon Punch from crouch. That game does still, however, require the full quarter circle forward input for a fireball though, so no luck there. Skipping ahead a generation to Capcom's Street Fighter IV, a game that is pretty damn notorious for its input shortcuts, where a move like Dragon Punch, which, is described by the game as forward, down, down, forward, can actually be inputted with any forward, any down, and any forward, meaning that this abomination is a valid input, does still require a full quarter circle forward for a fireball. But Capcom, being the originator of the input, don't actually hold the monopoly on the input or, fireballs in general. The 2021 release of Guilty Gear Strive is actually also quite known for its input leniency, housing the somewhat infamous 2626 super input shortcut, cutting out a full 33% of the described motion. Hilariously enough, not even Strive, with this extremely lenient double quarter circle forward input, allows for skipping of any of the 3 inputs in the fireball, meaning that double quarter circle forward is technically only one more input than the single one. I feel like we're kind of getting nowhere fast here, so why don't we just go down the list? No, 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 no. No, 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 yes? The GBA exclusive King of Fighters EX Neo Blood, which is about as edgy of a early 2000s title as I can think of, does in fact house a input shortcut for Fireball, allowing the player to skip the down forward input of the quarter circle forward entirely, and interestingly enough actually allowing an interchangeable down input, meaning both down forward and down back forward are valid fireball inputs. This, even though the move list of the game itself does actually show you a full quarter circle forward for the input. Now we can guess at the reasoning for this decision. Maybe SNK felt that a portable fighting game ought to have more lenient inputs, or maybe someone just fucking hated the GBA D-pad, I don't know. The most important fact here though is that for the follow-up, King of Fighters EX2 Howling Blood, which, also kind of a banger title, SNK decided to axe this input, meaning that you again need the full 3 inputs to execute a fireball, and you can no longer interchange the down input. So while a quarter circle forward input shortcut does technically exist, it certainly didn't catch on, and I think for pretty good reason. Consider what you end up spending quite a lot of time doing in fighting games, 2D ones especially. You spend quite a large amount of time going from crouching to standing and pressing buttons. You know what would put a little bit of a wrench into that? Making that input execute a fucking special move when you didn't fucking want to every single fucking time. So we once again return to this list, trying to answer the second question, and now we are looking for the slowest possible valid fireball input. Now the answer to this second question is actually going to be a little bit harder to nail down, primarily because the question itself is a bit wonky. What do we consider a large or meaningful discrepancy between input speeds? I mean, I can tell you for a fact right now that there are games that have different input speeds required to execute a fireball. I just don't know how big these are and what constitutes a big enough, gap. So I think we'll return to that a bit later, and instead right now just take a look at all the beautiful data. Now I could give you the data set for every single game in a list, but that doesn't seem super readable, though I will still add it to the description. Instead, let's take a look at the data set from a couple of different perspectives. As a baseline, I can tell you that the slowest possible return for a valid fireball input actually comes from SNK's 1999 titles Garo Mark of the Wolves. Garo allows the player a whopping 16 frames per input to execute a fireball, which when you break it down means with the game running at 60 FPS you can take a whole 1.1 seconds to execute the fireball. A full second might to you still seem like a pretty low amount of time, but when I play back the inputs to you, I think you will see my point. On the other end of the spectrum, we have 97 Saturn game Groove on Fight, which clocks in at a lightning fast 5 frames per input, meaning you have about a third of the time to input a valid fireball motion as in Garo. A bit of a tangent, perhaps, but Groove on Fight has a pretty kick-ass intro, a fact that some other developers seem to have taken notice of at the time. So we have our high and low here of 274 and 79 represented in milliseconds, but the average value of all the titles lies pretty close to the middle at 140. If we dole out the values on a timeline where every year has its values averaged out, we get something like this. Now, while I think personal vindication is always a good reason for doing any research, looking at this data actually gives us some other pretty interesting perspectives, like how there doesn't seem to ever have been a sort of trend in rising or lowering numbers in input speeds. I think I have to, at this point, add that there are a couple of games I actually have omitted from this dataset. One, because it isn't actually a fighting game, though you still might be interested in knowing that the hidden fireball move in Mega Man X can be input very, very slowly. The second set of omitted data do all come from fighting games though, specifically from the fighting game series for the PlayStation 1 by Tamsoft called Battle Arena Toshinden. Battle Arena Toshinden 1, released in '95, allows for an insanely slow fireball input. If you thought Garo was snail pace, try taking that number, doubling it, and then some. With an average of 39 frames per input, you get more than half a second per input to execute a fireball. Perhaps the developers at Tamsoft felt that reaching a new audience at the home console level and this being a new 3D fighting game required the inputs to be pretty damn lenient. I don't know. I do know though that the sequel, Toshinden 2, released later that very same year, actually drastically reduced this window, giving the game a very forgiving but not quite as massive 19 frames per input. Now, if these were the only outliers, I probably would have still kept them in the dataset, but for reasons unknown, Toshinden 3 again widens this input window. Maybe there was an internal power struggle for accessibility. Maybe someone accidentally added an extra 0 in a line of code. All I know is that Toshinden 3 allows for a staggering, ungodly, frankly, sort of unnerving 59 full frames per input, baby. The 4-second fireball input is real and it hates us. For the fourth and final iteration of the series, this window was again chopped down to a measly 10 frames per input, marking it as wholly insignificant in the grand scheme of fighting games. Anyhow, back to the question at hand. I think looking at these numbers, one could come to the conclusion that John Duffy was right, and that quarter circle forward inputs have meaningful differences between titles over the years. And that I am thusly guilty of being an ignorant bitch. There's just one niggling little issue with that though. While there is a seemingly significant difference in these values, the fastest required speed from Groove on Fight is actually shared with another title, or I guess a bunch of them. There's this like pretty niche 3D fighting game series. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called Tekken. Yes, every Tekken title from Tekken 1 in 94 to Tekken 8 in 2024 requires the same fastest possible input speed for a quarter circle forward. Meaning the forever gatekeeper to accessing pretty much every fireball in every fighting game ever made is resident cool guy Paul Phoenix and his iconic Death Fist. I think gatekeeper here is also a misnomer. He's a pretty generous gatekeeper. 79 milliseconds might seem awfully quick, but it is actually somewhat generous. And while that is, of course, my personal opinion, I have never, ever, in my entire life, heard anyone say that the problem for struggling Paul Phoenix players is that they aren't doing enough Death Fist. So with all this said, I think the answer to both these questions is a pretty resounding. Neither the inputs required nor the speed they demand have meaningfully changed over fighting game history. Which leaves me with only one final thought. Don't you ever fucking question me again, hear it? Don't you fucking...